Our bodies are largely made of water. Water makes up about 75% of the body mass of infants, about 60% of the body mass of young males, 50% of the body mass of young females, and about 45% of the body mass of people in older age. Liquid water has several properties that make it necessary for life as we know it. There needs to be a reason why water makes up this much of our bodies. Water has a high heat capacity, meaning it can absorb and retain and even release large amounts of energy without changing temperature very much. Since you want your homeostasis to be around 98.6 degrees, this ability to maintain temperature, even though we're gaining and losing energy, is pretty important to us. Water also has a high heat of vaporization. Not only does it take a lot of energy to make water change temperature, it takes even more energy to make water turn into a vapor. Water also displays a characteristic called reactivity, meaning we can use water as part of chemical reactions in the body. Specifically, hydrolysis is using water to help split large molecules into smaller molecules, like splitting a protein into its individual amino acids involves hydrolysis. Water can also act as a cushion, but probably the most important characteristic I'd like to focus on is that water is a polar solvent. Remember that the bonds holding water together are polar covalent bonds, meaning that water takes on partial electrical charges. The oxygen starts to act negative, and the hydrogens start to act positive. This means that anything else that has an electrical charge will dissolve in water, dissolve in our bodies, and move around easily from place to place, including most organic compounds like glucose and amino acids, salts or electrolytes like sodium, potassium, chlorine, and calcium, acids and bases, as well as our respiratory gases all dissolve easily in water and move around easily within the body. Water occupies two main fluid compartments within the body. The first is our intracellular fluid, or ICF, which accounts for about 2/3 of all of the water in the body. The other 1/3 is found in what's called the extracellular fluid, or ECF. This ECF, the extracellular fluid, is further subdivided into the plasma component of our blood and the interstitial fluid that's found in the spaces between tissue cells. Remember, your blood should stay trapped within a blood vessel or the chamber of the heart. Your blood should not touch the other tissues of your body, but those tissues need to be filled with and surrounded by fluid in order to stay alive. That interstitial fluid is the fluid that's actually touching most of the living cells of your body. There are other fluids like lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, the humors of the eye, and others that are generally lumped in as part of the interstitial fluid, although they are technically their own kinds of fluids in the body. If we were to look at all of these fluid compartments, we'd see it broken down kind of like this. The body has somewhere around 40 liters of water in it, 25 liters of which are found within our cells in the intracellular fluid. The other 12 liters, or another 12 liters, is found in the interstitial space, and 3 is found in the plasma portion of our blood. Water is this universal solvent that dissolves a variety of solutes, including our non-electrolytes. Those are things like organic compounds like glucose, lipids, amino acids, as well as the electrolytes. Electrolytes are those chemicals that dissociate or break apart into charged particles when they're dropped into water. Sodium, potassium, calcium, chlorine, acids, and bases are all good examples of electrolytes. All dissolved solutes, whether they're non-electrolytes or electrolytes, contribute to the osmotic gradients of fluids, the pulling of water from one compartment to the next. However, electrolytes have the greatest effect because they dissociate into multiple particles. What really matters for this osmotic gradient is the number of particles that are dissolved in water. If we drop sodium chloride into water, it dissociates into sodium and a chloride ion. That means that it's actually two different particles dissolved in water in our body. Magnesium chloride, when it's dropped into water, splits into a magnesium ion as well as two different chlorine ions. That means that it's split now into three different particles. Whereas most non-electrolytes, like glucose, are very large particles, but there's still only one particle. When we dissolve glucose into water, it remains glucose. Glucose is much larger than sodium or chlorine or magnesium, but it's still only one particle, so it only exhibits the osmotic pressure that one single sodium would have. This brings us back to some things that we've seen all through the term. That is that sodium is the major cation, the major positively charged ion in the extracellular environment. Potassium is the major cation in the intracellular environment. In the extracellular space, we also see a difference in the anions, or negatively charged particles. In the extracellular space, we can see that bicarbonate and the chloride ions are the major anions, while intracellularly we see a lot of hydrogen phosphate, sulfate, and proteins that provide the negative charges within the cells. If we added all of these different charges together, we'd see that the body has a neutral charge overall. We have just as many positives as negatives within the body. Osmotic and hydrostatic pressures regulate the exchange and mixing of fluids between the intracellular and extracellular spaces. Water moves easily along osmotic gradients. And this unequal distribution of solutes, a lot of sodium in one place, a lot of potassium in another, leads to osmotic gradients that move that water from one place to another within the body. Exchange between the plasma and the interstitial space occurs across capillary walls. Hydrostatic pressure pushes nearly protein-free fluid into this interstitial space on the arterial side of a capillary bed, while osmotic pressure pulls most of that fluid back in on the venous side. The lymphatic system returns any remaining fluid that does not get pulled in on that venous side. Exchange between the interstitial space and the intracellular space has to occur across plasma membranes. Again, water moves relatively freely into and out of the cells across the plasma membrane, but ions move selectively by active transport through protein channels and pumps. The osmolarities of the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid are normally relatively equal, but we can adjust those osmolarities to control the movement of water from one space to another. Here, we can take a look at the normal movement of materials in water from one compartment to the next. If we take a look at the movement of gases, for example, the lungs are bringing in a relatively large amount of oxygen that dissolves into the plasma, meaning that the partial pressure of oxygen in the plasma should be higher than the interstitial space, which causes oxygen to diffuse down that partial pressure gradient and into the interstitial space. The cells are using that oxygen for cellular respiration, so they should have an even lower oxygen content, so oxygen gets drawn in across the plasma membrane. As the cell performs cellular respiration, it produces carbon dioxide, so the cell should always have a higher carbon dioxide content than the interstitial space. This causes carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the cells into the interstitial space, and because of that, the interstitial space should have a higher carbon dioxide content than the blood plasma. That means that carbon dioxide continues to move down its partial pressure gradient into the blood and circulate back to the lungs. At our digestive tract, we are taking in a large amount of nutrients. So those nutrient concentrations, like glucose concentrations, should be high in the gastrointestinal tract, which would cause diffusion of glucose and other nutrients into the plasma, which means that glucose concentrations in our plasma should be higher than those concentrations in the interstitial space. So glucose will travel down its concentration gradient and into the interstitial space. The cells are using that glucose for cellular respiration, so they should have an even lower glucose content. That means that glucose will continue falling down its concentration gradient and into the cells. The reverse is true for nitrogenous kinds of waste. Because the cells are doing metabolism, they're breaking down nutrients like amino acids and nucleotides, they're producing nitrogenous kinds of waste. That means that nitrogen waste contents in our cells should be higher than the interstitial space, so those nitrogenous waste diffuse out of the cell into the interstitial space. Because of that, the concentrations should be higher than what's found in the blood plasma. That means that nitrogenous waste will continue moving down their concentration gradient into the plasma, and as they circulate through the kidneys, it will get filtered out of our blood, meaning that the nitrogen content of our blood plasma should always be relatively low compared to the interstitial space, because we have this exiting of the nitrogenous waste down in the nephrons of the kidney.